Shalom, Kal Halayim La Yahweh, Bahashem Yahushai, Bahashem Racha HaKurash. Double honors to the apostles, elders, and bishops of GMS Ruwell, and salutations and blessings to you elect, starting with 144,000 on down. So this is a lesson dealing with, history of Gad in Canada, with the residential schools and the pretty much a genocide, of the Gadites. And this is coming from a book called Unrepentant, okay, by this guy Kevin Annette. You can find this PDF. You can just type in the PDF and find this. It's a very, very, very good book. Goes into history and his own personal investigation. This guy was a Roman Catholic priest, and you can actually watch the documentary. The first time I heard about this person, it was a documentary, right? It's called Unrepentant: Kevin Annette and Canada's Genocide, right? You can watch it on online. It's about almost 2 hours long. It'll get you really pissed off, and this is something not really spoken about or known in Canada because, they keep it on the low, right? These guys, these devils are really covert. And yeah, I recommend this documentary. Try not to see Edomites after this for a short short amount of time, because you're gonna be pissed off. But anyway, let's get into some history. This is page 111. Eugenics imperative. Behind all of these measures to stop reproduction among Indians lay a unifying ideology known as eugenics. The belief that the genetic quality of humanity can be improved by the destruction of supposed inferior groups, like mentally and physically impaired people, the morally unfit, and specific racial groups, especially Negro and Aboriginal people. Eugenics emerged from within the American medical and psychiatric professions in the post-Civil War years, as America swelled with immigrants and the inner cities of the new industrial era teemed with the poor. By 1880, establishment leaders were calling for measures to stop Anglo-Saxon culture from being diluted by an encroaching others. And that's some pride from you Edomites, because you're not Anglo-Saxon, all right? We know you devils, all right? We know you serfs, you dwellers of the Caucasus Mountains, all right? You wild men, you savages. We know who you are, okay? You want to try to trick the world, or you have tricked the world, but the world is waking up now. All right, you're not angelic sons of Isaac. You're the devil or the demonic sons of Isaac. Okay. The philosophy struck a chord in North America, where a similar conquest of inferior races had been proceeding for centuries. Eugenics caught on like wildfire, not only among medical, financial, and political elites, but social reformers like Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, and judicial liberals like Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who made decisions authorizing the forced sterilization of American citizens with lower IQs. And this is a quote from Margaret Sanger, the devil. The most merciful thing that a large family can do to one of its infant members is to kill it. Women and New Race, 1920. And this is who these 304s, these silly bops, these silly chicken heads are clapping for. Margaret Sanger. You guys keep following the blind, until you fall into a fucking ditch. You're about to fall into a ditch. Canadian progressives also favored eugenics. It was a quasi-progressive government, the United Farmers of Alberta, which enacted Canada's first sterilization laws in 1928. And NDP Premier Tommy Douglas, who ushered in Canada's first Medicare system, was a strong advocate of sterilizing the unfit. Page 112. By 1891, the first sexual sterilization laws had been legislated in the USA. By 1920, 38 states had established laws to render infertile the mentally feeble, criminals, and in some cases immigrants. But in Canada, eugenics laws were applied much more broadly and aimed specifically at Aboriginal and Métis people. As mentioned, sexual sterilizations were made legal in Canada in Alberta in 1928 and in British Columbia in 1933, and allowed any child in an industrial school, which included Indian residential schools, to be made infertile. The Canadian laws were eventually applied far more broadly than in the USA, and besides feeble minded people, targeted the morally and socially unfit. This included unwed mothers, runaways, criminals, immigrants, and Indians, since the latter, being pagans, were deemed to be on a lower evolutionary plane than whites and thus less civilized. Page 113. The Canadian sterilization laws also created a eugenics board that could impose sterilizations on people without their consent. This became a common practice, especially in relation to Indians. In hospitals where eugenics research was conducted, fatality from tuberculosis and the practice of deliberately housing the sick with uninfected patients were identical practices in residential Indian residential schools. In fact, the same practice of not attending to sick children in residential schools and letting them die occurred in mercy killings hospitals run by eugenics researchers in the USA during the early 20th century. To quote Edwin Black, quite quiet euthanasia of defective newborns was not uncommon. Dr. Harry Hazelden, the Chicago Northside Hospital chief of staff, regularly ordered his staff to withhold treatment from several deformed or birth defected infants. Other times he would handle it personally, like the time he left a newly delivered infant's umbilical cord untied and let it bleed to death. Sometimes he took a more direct approach and simply injected newborns with opiates. Such medical murder of American children in Chicago in 1915 was not uncommon and increased when tuberculosis was involved, since according to the eugenics creed, so popular among doctors, diseases like tuberculosis were caused genetically. Hence, killing off those with defective genes, including Indians, would halt the spread of tuberculosis and other diseases. Page 120. Now we're getting into missing people, and this is what I wanted to do for years, because I've had this book for years, and I would do history. I would bring history from it, dig into it. But this guy, Picton, right, brothers in Canada, some of you brothers are maybe young, too young, but I remember Picton. That was big news in the media, right? Picton was a guy, he's a farmer in British Columbia, who was ultimately convicted. Hold on one second. All right, this guy Picton, this is his farm, and pretty much this guy was this devil was he was used. He was a low level guy. I won't say super low level. He was on a level, but what I mean by low level was he was the guy that he was the fault boy, the scapegoat. There's a lot of things that was happening here, a lot of missing people, and he would mix the pig meat with human meat, and there's a lot of things happening here that we don't know about still. But we know through this book I'm going to bring out that high level people were involved. Okay, so this is Missing People, page 120. The disappearance of a young white woman in northern BC in early 2004 alerted the media to the everyday reality of Aboriginals there, the regular abduction and murder of Native women and even of entire families along the infamous Route 16, the Highway of Tears. Over 500 Native women are unaccounted for since 1989, and yet the RCMP still claims that only 9 have disappeared. Leguerin has more than just a theory of what has happened to some of them. In 1990, he witnessed Dave Picton, brother of now convicted Willie Picton, deliver bags of soil to the Musqueam Reserve and bury them in a landfill site. Years later, after Picton was identified and arrested, Guerin recognized Picton on TV and remembered the incident and began digging in the site where Picton had buried the bags. I found a lot of bones, maybe a dozen big bags full. I took some of them to a forensic guy at Simon Fraser University, and his report said they were pig bones mixed up with human ones, including the skull and humerus of a young woman in her 20s. So I sent all the information to the police. Page at the end of 120. That's the old telltale sign of deep collusion, commented retired RCMP officer George Brown, a former native constable who established a community task force into missing people in Vancouver's downtown east side in 2004. Quote, none of them want to look into it because the cops and feds are involved in those missing people. 10 of the last 12 women to disappear were seen being taken by Mounties out to Picton's killing farm. Picton was the fall guy for a big operation involving drugs, child trafficking, snuff films, even organ trafficking. And this stuff's going on every day, man. Every fucking day. You know? Every day. This was just a bust because it was so frequent and so many people seen it happen in downtown Vancouver. Women being snatched and people hearing and talking and this and that it had to come out in the news. But that's how much filth was oozing out of the pot, if you will, you know. And there's so many other pots, man. There's a lot of things going on in Canada, especially in America, but in little old quiet Canada, little old you know, well-to-do and well-mannered speaking Canada, yes, many of these occurrences happen. You know, I remember 2-3 years ago I went up camping for 2 days by Sault Ste. Marie, all the way up north. It was like a 10 to 12 hour drive, something like that. And there's one place I was driving through, and there's a sign, and it was Gad, you know, it was all, when you start going certain places, you'll see, you start seeing names, and a lot of the names are Hebrew, they're derivatives of Hebrew, and it'll say Mohawk territory or this and that. And there's a sign that said, you know, missing woman, this, and you know, this is a missing woman hotspot, pretty much. And they had I think it was orange dresses or red dresses or something like that representing it was, and they were just hanging. So you'd be driving for kilometers and you just see a red dress, red dress, red dress, and the feeling is very eerie, very spooky. Like, god damn, this is a, you know, this is crazy. Like, it just feels like there's spirits out here, you know, and a lot of missing people, Gadites women up there, all across Canada. Okay, so Picton was the fall guy. That's the scuttlebutt. We know that 50 or 100 women and some men go missing every year from Vancouver streets, probably more, and 90% of them are Aboriginal. See, so we got drugs, child trafficking, snuff films, organ trafficking. You know, they do their satanic rituals. So this is a RCMP officer telling you, a constable. Okay? And George Brown and his associates on the community task force halted their investigations after 2 years once they learned that policemen, politicians, and businessmen were involved in the disappearances. We didn't want to get killed. One of my former bosses on the force called me up and said, George, quit screwing around before you get yourself killed. The number of missing women is 9 and it stays at 9. Hell, I know of 2 Mounties who were working with Picton, getting big bucks, providing him with victims. We documented hundreds of them, of these missing people, and kept turning up that kind of collusion. This is March 13, 2006. You know, so let's go into some history now. Now this is also dealing with, again, Canada. That things you don't hear about, right? We got MK Ultra, massive trauma and experimental mind control. Now there's actually a documentary from the Fifth Estate, which is I believe it's a CBC news outlet, but it's a special kind of news, I don't know what you call it, program or whatever. The Fifth Estate, they did MK Ultra coverage, I believe in the 70s in Canada. They would just do regular people. So imagine what they did with GAD. We're going to read about it. Beyond these clear economic and political motives, one of the purposes behind the residential school tortures was to create a large pool of preconditioned experimental test subjects for the heavily funded military studies into mind control that dominated scientific research during the Cold War and beyond. Following World War II, the U.S. military was deeply concerned that only a small percentage of its troops had shown a willingness to engage in combat. Could the personality and aggressiveness of average citizens be molded and their thoughts controlled to make them better killing machines? This question prompted the massive covert research program codenamed MKUltra, commenced by the CIA in 1952. Since Nazi Germany had pioneered this research in its death camps, the CIA secretly imported hundreds of SS doctors into America under Project Paperclip and put them to work at facilities all over the USA and Canada. Their chief research subjects were children from military families. This is a big thing, man. When you see people in doing well in the entertainment world, sports world, a lot of times they're children of military parents. And that's not a coincidence. They go through training. And I'm not talking about regular training. Okay, they go through conditioning. A lot of them guys are MK Ultra babies. You know, that's just fact. Right? Military families or those stolen from orphanages, hospitals, and Indian residential schools. One of the main purposes of these experiments was to test the limit of human endurance to pain and torture, and to assess how trauma affected the ability of people to think and act under duress. Children, especially if they were Indians, were easy to obtain for these studies, and in some cases were deliberately tortured to death as part of studies by researchers working alongside Nazi and SS doctors. Sarah Hunter, a pseudonym, is a Caucasian woman and the child of a military officer who survived these experiments. In her book, Always Remember Love, Sarah claims that between 1956 and 58, she was imprisoned in the former Lincoln Park Air Force Base in Calgary, Alberta, and subject to rape, torture, and experiments, along with 25 other children. The experiments were run, she claims, by a Nazi doctor codenamed Bob Armstrong, whose SS tattoo number was 09 and whose cover was a major in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Sarah claims that all the other children and a similar number of abducted adults were deliberately tortured to death in special soundproof cells by Armstrong and his assistants, all of them Canadian and American scientists. The bodies of the murdered people were then disposed of at a local mink farm owned by a man named Jim Green. The Canadian military provided security for the operation. See? A lot of these farmers, man, they're just you don't know. They have a big ass farm. They had 20, 40, 50, 60 acres of land. And you don't know what the hell's going on over there. What kind of meat's being grinded up, what the fuck's going on. Sarah recounted to the author in 2005, I was the only one to survive. All the other kids died. Bob Armstrong kept me alive. I think it was to look at the long-term effects on me as I got older. He pretended to like me, but he couldn't love anyone. I saw him burn a little girl to death with a blowtorch and have a man's ear pulled off with pliers. All the time, men in white coats and a British lady, they were all taking notes, even with all the blood and screaming. These are sick fucking Edomites, man. You know, when you watch that movie Hostel, which I'm never gonna watch that shit again. I watched it a couple times, but you got Hostel 1, Hostel 2. When you go up to 3, 4, and all those other shits, they just go crazy with the torture. But 1 and 2, they really show you facts, man. The Edomites, bro, they get off on those tortures, and that's their sacrifices, and that's where their power is drawn from. They're not wise, they're not so great. Their power comes from the brutality, man, the gore. You know? That's crazy, bro. You just torturing somebody, blood, screaming, and you're just, oh, patient is presenting signs of pain, and patient is in excruciating pain, and you know? That's these devils, man. Sarah says that many of the children who were killed were Aboriginal, along with runaways and orphans. Armstrong told her that one of the men watching the tortures was a senior RCMP liaison officer with the U.S. government, and that he had brought the Indian kids from the local boarding school. I think he was proud of what he was doing, like he was making history. He was using me as his sounding board, as if I was writing a book about him. He'd say, this will win me the Nobel Prize, and the Yankees will never be able to thank me for what I am teaching them. You know, and that's not a coincidence that they needed Teeman, the mighty men of Teeman. You know, them Teemanites, man, they've been doing this kind of research. So when they got transferred over and they said, oh, we get to work on Indian kids, oh, I love that. Like I said in that movie Hostel, that guy was, hey, man, that guy was happy. You know, he was cutting off a piece of the guy's thigh and then just eating it, and just, you know, them German Edomites, man, just some sickos, bro. Sick motherfuckers, man. It says, The presence of other Nazi researchers at Indian residential schools on Canada's west coast, such as Cooper Island in 1939, indicates a pattern in these experiments which relied on a large number of already traumatized live test subjects, like the children found in a typical Indian residential school, run in the 1930s by a German Catholic order known as the Montforts. Cooper Island Residential School witnessed many killings of children, as described in this book's first section on homicides. But in January 1939, German speaking doctors arrived at the school and began, as at Lincoln Park, experimenting on batches of 25 children. Arnold Sylvester, another Cooper Island survivor who endured the needles, told IHRAAM judges, which is an international tribunal, I believe, we couldn't figure out who those Germans were. They dressed different and needed interpreters. They treated us like we were cattle, just shoved a needle in us and threw us in these little rooms to be watched like bugs under glass. I was so sick, I couldn't keep anything down. I still have the scars from those shots. We were told to never talk about it, especially after Sandy and other kids died from the shots. This similar pattern in Germany and Canada shows a direct link between murderous experiments on the innocent, both before and after World War II, and a probable joint research program between America, Canada, and Nazi Germany. This reality was clarified by a source within the Canadian government who spoke with the author a few months after the June 1998 tribunal. The man, a retired senior civil servant, stated in a phone conversation with the author on October 2nd, 1988, a gentleman's agreement was in place during those years. Say from 1950 onwards, the churches provided kids from the residential schools, and the Mounties brought them to whoever needed a fresh batch of subjects. Doctors, mostly sometimes D&D, Department of National Defense, almost always the Americans. This was the Cold War. Lots of research money out there from the Pentagon if you had a new idea how to create the perfect mindless killer. The Indians, they were already under lock and key. You could do anything you wanted to them. The churches were more than happy to turn them over as long as they kept getting their money for them from Ottawa. That's why it went on for so long. Even with that huge death rate, there was lots of money to be made. And that's why it'll never be acknowledged officially. See? So these devils, man, you got a lot to pay for, man. All these things are going to come out, especially in the day of judgment, Yahweh Shabbat. Okay? All these things are going to come out, man. So now let's get into some history, just dealing with Canada. Okay, this is page 37, going back a bit in time in general. For example, after the arrival of the first Jesuits in New France, now Quebec, in 1611, that order declared open warfare on the Indian nations allied with the rival English, and even any neutral Indian nation like the Algonquins. As a major actor and investor in the fur trade, the Jesuits stood to profit by eliminating Indian nations that diverted furs into English hands, and so by 1640 the Jesuits had agreed to a plan with Governor Montmagny of New France to hunt down and exterminate all non-Christian Algonquins. The Jesuit black robe missionaries spread smallpox, firearms, and alcohol among the Algonquins of eastern Canada so effectively that over 3/4 of them were wiped out within a generation. The disease spread to neighboring tribes with the result that even French allies like the Hurons were hugely depopulated and made virtually extinct by the year 1700. The English as well relied on germ warfare as a chief weapon against hostile native tribes, as described by British General Geoffrey Amherst in July 1763 in a letter to a subordinate regarding the local Micmacs. You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race. Extirpate means to exterminate, pretty much, destroy. I should be very glad if your scheme for hunting them down by dogs could take effect. I would rather choose the liberty to kill any savage that may come in our way than to be perpetually doubtful whether they are friends or foes. In 1749, the Nova Scotia legislature passed a series of scalping proclamations which rewarded £10 sterling to anyone who delivered the scalp of a male Micmac Indian to a local magistrate. £5 was offered for the scalp of a woman or child. As and again, this turned people into scalp hunters. You know, this was big money. This is not no small money. £10 sterling, silver. We're talking about £10 and £5 for a woman or child. So this made regular people with Edomites without a job, Edomites with jobs. You know, laborers, farmers, whatever. They said, "Fuck that! I'm not gonna do this. I'm gonna go, get my money. Make my fortune all across not only Canada but America, because large amounts of money was offered. Okay, a big bounty was offered at certain times. As among the Spanish, Indians who converted to Christianity were generally spared outright murder by the French and English, who usually enslaved them. Indian slavery was instituted by both nations during the fur trade wars of the 1600s. And see, this is going into the point that, right, it was both kingdoms, man. Right, this is Jeremiah 15:33. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh of hosts, the children of Israel and the children of Judah, which Israel is Samaria, northern kingdom, and Judah being the southern kingdom, okay, were oppressed together. Okay, and all that took them captives held them fast. They refused to let them go. So was Gad, Reuben, Issachar, Ephraim, were they taken captive? Were they enslaved? Yes. Not under the same ferocity as the kingdom of Judah, but yes, they were enslaved. They were killed. They were massacred. They were germ warfare was applied to them. You know. Okay, so going back here, Indian slavery was instituted by both nations during the fur trade wars of the 1600s and continued until well into the 19th century, 1800s. By 1761, over one-tenth of all registered burials in Montreal were those of Indian slaves, who were called Panis, a derivation of the name for American Pawnee Indians, who also faced enslavement. Much of early Halifax and Montreal was built by both Negro and Indian slaves, although the colonial authorities preferred the latter because of their cheap availability. So a lot of Gadites slaves in Canada, you know. It says, page 40, after the English conquest of Canada in 1759, their Indian allies like the Mohawks and Iroquois people signed treaties with England which ostensibly recognized their nationhood. In reality, then as now, all lands were understood to be owned by the crown and merely occupied by Indians. Even victorious Indians like the Six Nations found themselves decimated by European diseases and fenced onto restrictive reserve lands under laws which denied them either nationhood or citizenship within what would become Canada. Further, the crown had granted the Roman Catholic Church absolute hegemony in Lower Canada, Quebec, to operate schools, hospitals, and civic life in return for ensuring a domestically tranquil populace. This power allowed the Catholic Jesuit order to establish the first boarding schools among Indian nations during the 1820s, a practice soon copied by the Anglican Church in Upper Canada, Ontario, where the first Indian boarding school, the Mohawk Institute, was established in Brantford in 1832. And we did a lesson there years ago. This guy, Kevin Annette, in his documentary, he mentions it as well. There's a lot of children buried in that school. They found bodies there before. So a lot of torture, a lot of crimes were committed in Brantford over there. This religious assault on native people was accompanied by a legal one in 1842. The Bagot Commission, set up jointly by the Vatican and its subsidiary, the Crown of England, began the process of outright cultural genocide against Indians by recommending the establishment of industrial schools among native children where they would learn industry and agriculture, forget their languages and customs, and be wiped out as nations. Acting on this report, and see, this is the real purpose of those schools. You got some of these Judite bugouts, man, on TikTok. They make a highlight video saying, see, it says Indian training school. That means these people were trained to copy the Indians. No, you idiot, you dummy. You fucking morons, man. You see, you make one quote, one highlight, and that becomes a whole doctrine. No, you idiot. This is the real history right here. This is what the schools were created for, to wipe out, forget their language and customs, and to traumatize them. Clearly, they were taken from those residential schools and put into MK Ultra training programs. They were tortured in those schools by the priests and nuns. They were killed. So what are you talking about, man? You got a lot of bug outs, bro. These were Israelites, okay? These were no fucking Moabites. You got that rhetoric out there. These were Israelites that were placed under heavy curses, man. The fuck are you talking about? It says, acting on this report, the legislature of Upper Canada passed the Gradual Civilization Act in 1857, which laid the basis for the present-day Apartheid Indian Act, which segregates Indians into a subclass of non-citizenship as legal wards of the state in perpetuity, meaning continuation to this day. To this day. The 1857 Act eradicated native nationhood by offering a limited enfranchisement to Indians who could still not vote, own property, or be citizens under the law once they surrendered title to their land. This act was an enormous blackmailing of the surviving native peoples of Canada, compelling them to either accept permanent serfdom and self-destruction through enfranchisement, or to remain as permanent outsiders, prey to slaughter and displacement. It was also a green light to white settlers to disregard the rights and territories of native populations who now had no inherent right to their own land. Finishing up page 42, within the decade following Confederation, Canada created the legal and police systems to contain native populations as part of their long-term extermination. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police, forerunner to the RCMP in 1873 and the Indian Act in 1876, both of these institutions were designed to force Indians off their lands onto reservations and eventually into residential schools to clear the path westward for the expanding Canadian Pacific Railway, created in 1881 to solidify Canada east to west through massive immigration and settlement. The Indian Act is a cage around every Aboriginal person in Canada and is legislation which has altered little in 130 years. It is the kind of race-based discriminatory law that has been banned by international human rights conventions since 1945, yet for some reason is allowed to persist in Canada. Under it, Native peoples are dependent slaves on their own land under the control of one man, the Federal Minister of Indian Affairs. The opening words of the Indian Act declare that Aboriginal people occupy land, the legal title to which is invested in Her Majesty. That is, the Crown, which defines who and who is not an Indian under the law. Indians on reserves cannot own their own land, elect free and independent governments, conduct their own business affairs, or even provide adequately for their children. The Act even denies Indians the rights to refuse hospitalization or medical treatment or move about freely. Under Section 35 of the original Act, church or government agents could remove any Indian from their home using any force necessary, a provision which allowed Native children to be kidnapped into residential schools, hospitals, or any other place, and gave such agents the right to harm or kill their parents if they resisted. Under the same provision, troublesome or defiant Indians could be expelled from their own land and separated forever from their family and culture. After 1927, Indians were not allowed to hire lawyers or even represent themselves in a court of law. Until 1966, a special pass identical to those issued under apartheid in South Africa was necessary for any Indian to leave their reserve. No Indian could vote in Canada until 1960, and Native women not until the 1970s. Even more telling is the fact that Indians on reserves are considered mere occupants of the land and are granted temporary certificates of occupancy rather than deeds or titles to their homes or lands. And of course, the deed and title you cannot own, especially in Canada, maybe in America, but even in America, you're subject to something called eminent domain, but in Canada, you can't own, you don't have ownership to the title. Okay, to the deed, to the title of the land. That title is known as allodial title, which when you go into allodial title, all allodial title belongs to the crown of England. Okay, so these Gadites, they're known as squatters. You know, as transient squatters, they can be evicted at will by the government, and their band councils are mere puppet bodies that can be dispersed at any time by the Minister of Indian Affairs. Yet only by living in such imprisoned serfdom can Indians receive any government funding, since off-reserve natives are not entitled to such assistance. Okay? And let me just finish off on this. This man's a fucking devil, man. You're on your way out, Esau. Okay? Ezekiel 35:6. Therefore, as I live, said the Lord power, I will prepare thee unto blood, and blood shall pursue thee. Sith thou hast not hated blood, even blood shall pursue thee. Thus will I make Mount Seir most desolate, and cut off from it him that passeth out, and him that returneth. And I will fill his mountains with his slain men. In thy hills and in thy valleys and in all thy rivers shall they fall that are slain with the sword. I will make thee perpetual desolations, and thy cities shall not return, and ye shall know that I am the Lord Yahweh. Because thou hast said, these two nations and these two countries shall be mine, and we will possess it, whereas the Lord Yahweh was there. Which two nations? In the NLT, look, it shows you, for you said the lands of Israel and Judah will be ours. And it's really talking about the people. So you have taken the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel, or Samaria, or Ephraim. You have possessed them, and you have done with them whatever you wanted. We just read some of the things that you've done with them. One tribe, Gad. All the tribes you've done these things with, man. So the Most High is going to prepare you, man. And I like what it says in NLT, verse 6. As surely as I live, says the sovereign Lord Yahweh, since you show no distaste for blood, I will give you a bloodbath of your own. Your turn has come, you fucking devils, man. You fucking devils, man. This is where you're gonna get. Okay? Thus saith the Holy Bible, thus saith the Lord. Okay? Not me. Thus saith the Bible. So this is your future, man. Okay? Anyway, hope you brothers ratified with that. Check out the documentary, Unrepentant Canada's Genocide. Alright. So with that, I want to say shalom to the elect, Kwam Yasharallah.